Welcome to the deep dive, where we unpack your sources to find those really surprising insights. Have you ever felt like, you're studying for hours, but the knowledge just doesn't quite stick? Or maybe that traditional learning methods, they aren't fully tapping into your brain's incredible potential? Well, today we're diving into some groundbreaking research. It introduces, frankly, entirely new ways of thinking about how our brains truly learn. Now, many of you listening are probably well versed in learning theories, but some of the terms we'll hit today, things like learnography and brain pages, they might be completely new. So, our mission here is to make these really innovative ideas crystal clear. It's all drawn from Brain Activation through Learnography and Transfer Books by Shiva Narayan Sheila Page. This study suggests a pretty radical alternative that learning is maybe more about active transfer than just passive reception. Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how this research fundamentally challenges a core belief about education. The idea that learning actually requires teaching in the traditional sense. It suggests, the human brain is biologically engineered for learning, adaptation, and innovation. That's a quote from the source. Yet, it argues its true potential is often underutilized in traditional education systems. So the source is basically saying that the conventional teaching classroom, where students are often just passive listeners, well, that might actually be hindering our natural learning mechanisms. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
what if there's a profoundly different way, a more brain-aligned way to learn right there? Maybe just by using books differently.
That is a truly intriguing idea. And yeah, this deep dive really pushes us to rethink that whole dynamic. So, the core of this new approach, you mentioned it, it's called optimum learnography, and it seems to revolve around a special kind of resource, these books of knowledge transfer. Now, these sound like they're far from your typical textbooks, right? What makes them so different?
Absolutely. The research is very, very clear on this distinction. So, unlike conventional textbooks that often rely heavily on verbal explanations and maybe teacher-led instruction, these transfer books, as the source calls them, are specifically crafted for self-inquiry, brain page development, and motor coordination. The source defines them as being designed to directly transfer knowledge from the book to students' brain, rather than just serving as, say, a reference you look things up in. You should think of them less as just a collection of facts to passively consume, and maybe more like an instruction manual for actually building knowledge within your own mind. They're designed with very specific activities and structures, things that prompt internal processing.
Okay, so it's definitely not just about passively taking in information then. The source emphasizes motor engagement and this thing called brain page development. It almost sounds like we're literally building knowledge, maybe with our hands and minds. Can you walk us through what brain page development actually means and how our physical actions get involved?
Yeah, it's much more active than just reading or listening. Imagine brain pages, and this is key, not as physical pages in a book, but as actual cognitive maps or mental blueprints you construct inside your own head. So these transfer books, they don't just give you the information, they guide you to build these brain page modules. And you do that by actively writing or drawing, solving problems, visualizing concepts, that kind of thing. The source explicitly states that the act of writing, solving, rehearsing, and visualizing transforms knowledge into motor memory, fostering deep understanding and long-term retention. It's quite specific.
Huh. So it's a bit like an athlete practicing a skill. Maybe a basketball player shooting free throws. They don't just think about the shot, they physically do it over and over, building that muscle memory. So this research is suggesting that when you actually engage your hands, writing, drawing, physically manipulating things, you're firing up the motor cortex.
Yeah.
And that physical action isn't just, busy work. It's directly helping to kind of hardwire abstract concepts into your brain's memory systems, turning what they call cognitive knowledge into this deeply ingrained motor memory. Huh. Maybe my high school self, always doodling in the margins, was actually onto something useful.
Precisely, or at least closer than we thought. The study highlights that brain regions like your motor cortex, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum areas we traditionally associate with movement, are actually deeply involved in this knowledge transfer and brain page development. And this isn't just a general brain boost either. Optimum learnography is specifically targeting neural networks that are crucial for high-level learning. Think of, say, the hippocampus that's like your brain's primary save button for new memories, or the prefrontal cortex, which is your strategic planner for decision-making and problem-solving. What seems revolutionary here is how these transfer books aren't just generally stimulating the brain. The claim is they're specifically engineered to engage these key neural networks. That includes the posterior parietal cortex for spatial reasoning, which apparently underpins high-level learning and recall. And they do this by providing what the source calls modular and dimension-based content.
Dimension-based content. Okay, that sounds pretty intriguing. The source mentions 7 distinct dimensions of knowledge transfer that these books use. Can you give us a clearer picture of what those might actually look like in practice? Are they like different types of exercises?
Indeed, yeah. The study outlines 7 specific dimensions: definition spectrum, function matrix, block solver, hippocampus, module builder, task formator, and dark knowledge. Quite the names. And each of these corresponds to a particular style of neural engagement. The goal is what the study calls holistic cognitive activation. Mhm. So, for example, a definition spectrum might prompt you to define a concept from multiple angles scientifically, maybe historically, practically forcing a deeper, more nuanced understanding. Or something like block solver could involve breaking down a complex problem into its smallest parts, like a mental puzzle, and then putting it back together, engaging those prefrontal and parietal areas we mentioned. The whole process of creating these brainpage modules during self-study, for instance, is said to directly activate critical regions like the posterior parietal cortex, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus. They essentially become, quote, durable mental maps for knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense. And there's also something mentioned called cyclizide rehearsal. Is that just a fancy word for repetition, or is there a specific technique involved that's different?
It's definitely presented as more specific than simple repetition, and the research actually delves into the neurological mechanics behind it. Cycloside rehearsal is described as a technique used to revise and reinforce knowledge in a looped neural sequence, basically optimizing brain performance over time. Practically speaking, it means actively recalling and reconstructing information, not just passively rereading it. The study found that this specific type of repetition, particularly what they call thalamic cycloside rehearsal, improved memory strength. How? By forming these looped activations involving the thalamus, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. You could almost imagine it as creating a kind of high-speed, reinforced neural pathway for that specific information, which significantly boosts recall speed and long-term retention. It's about building a really robust, interconnected memory network.
Right, so if students are doing all this active work, constructing these brain pages, using motor skills, doing the cyclizide rehearsal thing, it really does sound like the traditional classroom model.
Yeah.
Where a teacher talks and students just passively listen is completely turned on its head. And this is where the study makes that really radical claim that teaching is not necessary. What does that truly imply for the role of an educator and the learning environment itself?
That's really the ultimate implication, isn't it? And it's a bold one, no doubt. The study advocates for a, quote, paradigm shift from the conventional talking classroom to the brain page classroom. It proposes that learning is not taught, but transferred directly from the book to the brain through the science of learnography. That's the core thesis. Now, this doesn't mean teachers just disappear, not at all. Instead, it dramatically shifts their role. They move from being primarily a content deliverer to becoming what the source calls a brain page moderator. So they're guiding student performance, providing very targeted feedback, making sure students are actively engaging with the material in this new way, rather than just passively receiving it. The student becomes the active constructor of knowledge, not merely a recipient. It's really about empowering the learner to take the lead in their own knowledge acquisition, leveraging their brain's natural capabilities.
Wow. What an incredible journey into this whole idea of the brain page classroom and the power of optimum learnography. It really fundamentally changes how you think about books and learning, doesn't it? I mean, the idea that we can move beyond just passive listening to actively constructing knowledge in our own brains using things like motor memory and these brain page modules, it's just so empowering when you think about it. So let's boil it down. What does this all mean for you, the listener, the learner?
Well, ultimately, this deep dive suggests a pretty radical shift in perspective, right? Learning isn't just about being taught something passively. It's framed as a dynamic transfer of knowledge happening directly, book to brain. It calls for learning environments to become these vibrant, active spaces where physical engagement is actually key, and where educators act more like facilitators, guiding students, rather than just being lecturers standing at the front. So you, the learner, become the architect of your own understanding. You leverage self-inquiry, writing, and these unique reinforcement techniques we talked about, like that cycloside rehearsal.
Yeah, it highlights that quote again. Cognitive knowledge is the potential energy of human brain, while the motor knowledge of working brain is the kinetic energy of knowledge transfer. It really suggests that to truly unlock your brain's learning power, you need to engage it physically, mentally, visually, using these transfer books as your guide.
Which leads us to a powerful final thought, maybe something for you to consider. What if we stopped thinking of learning primarily as a product of teaching someone something,
Mm.
and instead fully embraced it as a process of knowledge transfer, brain activation, and active self-construction?
Imagine that. Imagine a world where every learner feels empowered to build intelligence, autonomy, and mastery, book by book, brain page by brain page. This deep dive really calls us to fundamentally rethink how we approach learning, to discover the potential power of these transfer books in achieving genuine learning mastery. What if the key to unlocking your full intellectual potential was quite literally already in your hands, just waiting for you to open a book and engage your brain in this whole new way? Time to open a book, unlock your brain, as the source puts it.